So I want to talk about why bad things happen to us from an Akashic Records perspective. So this is based on what I see with my Akashic Records reading clients every day. And first of all, what I want to kind of stress here is that from a higher perspective, quote unquote, bad things maybe don't really exist in the sense of good and bad, that there is typically a reason for everything. There may be cases where things are just purely accidental, but that's not my experience. What tends to come through in my sessions are a number of things. One is people are balancing karma. And so, you were, a murderer in another, in another life, and, maybe you haven't been murdered, but, something bad has happened to you in this life. And in a sense, you're balancing out the energy. This can also be things where you're balancing things with specific people or specific collectives. So for example, where there's maybe been a case of, say, racism or race-based violence in, let's say, your family, and that you are maybe helping people of different races in this lifetime. And so again, there's a balancing going on there. The other thing I tend to see is where we're essentially an actor in somebody else's quote unquote movie, right? And so here it's an understanding of, in order for people to forgive, there has to be something to forgive, right? So in some cases, you might actually be the quote unquote bad guy in someone else's story. And this is an opportunity for them to forgive what couldn't be forgiven in the past. Obviously, when we look at things from this perspective, you're like, that just doesn't feel right, and that's because basically we don't really, most of us want to believe or understand the way that, these laws work, of the law of cause and effect, or what people call karma, right? A lot of people don't want to think about their life beyond this lifetime and to have a more multi-lifetime perspective. A lot of us are very invested in this idea that we are in some way victims, right? And that brings me to the other aspect of why bad things happen, right? We are manifesting all the time. We're manifesting based on what we consciously want, and we're manifesting based on what we believe, what our inner vibration is. And this is so critical. And this is, if people actually understood this, the world would really change, because people would focus so much more on their inner feelings, their inner thoughts, and less on the outer. If they really understood how much what's in here actually affects what you're experiencing out there, right? So, and this can be things along the lines of, if your self-image is, I'm not a successful person in any aspect of life, whether that's love, money, health, whatever. If your internal belief system is that I'm not successful at something, guess what? That's going to manifest. That's going to be what you're going to manifest. So for example, if you're, frustrated professionally, well, life is probably going to serve up frustration after frustration until you figure out how to change your story. Okay, now that's a whole different thing. How do we manifest? How do we change our direction? How do we make things improve? And that's a whole, frankly, a book. I'm going to be talking about this type of stuff going forward in this channel. But that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, is to understand there. So, in terms of action items, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, all right, so how is this useful to me? The first thing I would just say is, if you're experiencing difficulty in some aspect of your life, kind of ask that internal question: is there something that needs to be forgiven related to this? Okay. And maybe it's, forgiving yourself. Maybe it's asking forgiveness. And this can be even asking forgiveness energetically, meaning, if you, feel that you are balancing something, or that there's, some aspect with another person, you can say, forgive me to that person. If you have the opportunity to say it face to face, great. Okay. But energetically, even just doing it by yourself has a significant power to it. When it's something like karma, for example, and this idea, oh, maybe this happened to me because I'm balancing something from another life. Unless you're getting this information through an Akashic Records reading or something like that, you're not going to know. That's the part of sometimes just letting go and just being like, there's stuff going on in my life. I don't understand why, but I just trust that this is part of a greater plan. I know that can be difficult, especially, depending on the quote unquote severity of something going on. You can be like, really, I really, deserve this. What I will say is I've seen people that, for example, lost property, and that was related to a past life balancing. I've seen people that have experienced abuse, and that was, related to a past life pattern. And at least what I see with my clients is it's not always easy, but at least it brings some level of understanding of, okay, well, I didn't enjoy what I experienced, but if this serves to heal, so this doesn't have to happen again, we break the cycle, then for a lot of people, that's enough. And that helps them to let go. Okay, so, we've talked about a couple different aspects of when things, quote unquote, aren't working the way you'd like them to. Hopefully this helps you bring you some understanding. And like I say, when in doubt, forgive. Just as a general rule in life, forgive, ask forgiveness, and just see what happens. And sometimes that will bring the peace into whatever situation you're experiencing sooner or later. Hope this helps. Certainly leave me, some ideas in the comments if this resonates with you, or you've got more questions, and hopefully that'll help me, think about, how I can add some additional content along these lines going forward. And of course, if this resonates with you of, kind of light bulb goes off, obviously, check out my website, jsalisbury.com, and, you can see the different types of services I offer there. And maybe this is something that can help you too. All right. So thanks for listening. See you soon. Bye-bye.